Good morning. Once again, FCF. We are still on our trail where we're looking at painful memories. And I suppose of all the people in Scripture that I've ever read about, this one particular memory I think might be the most painful of anyone. It's one of those portions of Scripture that I always have a hard time getting through to this day myself, and I've read it many, many times. It's the portion of Scripture. Jesus has come to the end of his ministry. He has told his disciples that he was going to be betrayed. He has told them that they're going to, that very night, they're all going to run in fear and abandon him. And Peter speaks up and he says, they might do that. They might run and abandon you, but Lord, I'll go to the death with you. And Jesus has to tell Peter, he said, Peter, this night before the rooster crows, meaning at sunlight, you'll deny me 3 times. And Peter still rejects even Jesus' words, says, no way, Lord, no way, I'll go to the death. And of course we know the story that as Jesus is arrested and being beaten and so forth, Peter is outside and he's questioned not once, not twice, but 3 times he's questioned, aren't you one of his disciples? And Peter each time denies that he even knew Jesus. Let me pick up reading in Mark's Gospel, chapter 14. And let me start all the way back in verse 66. While Peter was below in the courtyard, and one of the servant girls of the high priest by, when she came to Peter when she saw Peter warming himself, she looked closely at him. You also were with the Nazarene Jesus, she said, but he denied it. I don't know or understand what you're talking about, he said, and went out into the entryway. When the servant girl saw him there, she said again to those standing around, this fellow is one of them. Again he denied it. After a little while, those standing near said to Peter, surely you are one of them, for you are a Galilean. He began to call down curses on himself, and he swore to them, I don't know this man you're talking about. Immediately, the rooster crowed the second time. When Peter remembered the word Jesus had spoken to him, before the rooster crows twice, you will disown me 3 times. And he broke down and he wept. So this was perhaps the most painful memory in all of Peter's life. You read that when Jesus rose from the grave, he sends word to tell Peter and the disciples that he wants to meet with them, so he made it very clear. He knew Peter was going to fail. He never gave up on him. But there comes a time in John chapter 20, or it could be chapter 21, I'd have to recheck that, where he has this conversation with Peter, and 3 times he says to Peter, Peter, do you love me? And Peter says, of course I love you. You know that. He says, well then feed my sheep. He says again, Peter, do you really love me? He says, Lord, you know. He says, well then feed my lambs. And then the 3rd time, Jesus says, Peter, do you love me? Remember, he denied Jesus. He denied him 3 times, and Jesus asked him 3 times, do you love me? Now, Jesus knew that he loved him, but Peter needed to experience in Jesus' presence that Jesus knew who he was, and he knew what kind of a man he was. And all Jesus says to him the 3rd time, he says, if you love me, then feed my lambs, or feed my sheep, he says for the 2nd time about the sheep. So we need to understand that even in our most horrific, painful failures in our loyalty to Jesus, it did not catch him by surprise. It is not fatal. It is not necessarily forever. Peter recovered from this, and he served the Lord loyally for the rest of his days, and he served with great kindness and great compassion and great humility and great boldness, not in spite of, I think because of. It's sometimes out of this brokenness, out of our deepest shame and remorse, that we become a much more pliable, a much more useful servant of God, a much more gentle person to interact as God's instrument between himself and someone else that perhaps is experiencing a lot of failure, a lot of shame as well. So I don't know if you've had the rooster crow 3 times for you, but know this, that Jesus knew in advance, and just as he restored Peter, he waits to restore each and every one of us. I hope this helps.